Hello, and welcome to this week's video about Christ and His church, going through the book of Luke and Acts this year, taking it one chapter at a time, looking at some of the lessons we can learn in these two great books of the Bible. This week we're on Acts chapter 6, and this chapter is fairly short, and there's not a ton going on, so this may be a little bit shorter of a video, which is okay. But it's talking about some of the growing pains that the early church experiences. And so the church is growing rapidly at this point. The word of God is spreading, the news about Jesus and who he is. The church is spreading, and a few growing pains come along with that. And we get a short little story about a little bit of those growing pains and how they're handled within the church. And before we even go into Acts chapter 6, I do want to say I don't really think this chapter is focused on that. I think this story in Acts chapter 6 is really setting up Acts chapter 7, because we have this beautiful story about Stephen and his death, and this great speech that he gives before his death, and his example of giving his life for the message of the church, for the message of Christ. All that came from somewhere. So I think really Acts chapter 6 is showing where Stephen came from and what led to his being killed. But I do think that doesn't mean that we can't get anything from the background of the story. But with that, this story has a few gaps. Like, it's really not very detailed, and I think that goes to even prove that point a little bit more. Some of the stuff that we read, I mean, there's just not a lot of detail about what's going on and what's happening. Again, I think that's because it's not really focused about this conflict in the church. It's focused about Stephen and where he came from. But again, I think we can still learn some things about us as a church and how we function and how we can function and should function. And then next week, you can hear more about Stephen, because it'll be all about Stephen probably next week. But Acts chapter 6. Now in these days, when the disciples were increasing in number, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. So here's the problem. We have the whole goal of the book of Acts. Sorry, ran into my desk. The whole goal of the book of Acts is take the word about Jesus, the news of the gospel, to Judea, Samaria, and the rest of the world. And so they're in the process of doing that. But right now in Acts, we're still in the Judea part, right? We haven't really gotten too far out into the world yet. So we're still focused on Jerusalem and Judea and spreading the news of Jesus there. And so with that, you still have some different divisions. And one of those divisions are the Jews, or the Christians and the followers who are in Jerusalem, and some of those followers who are outside of Jerusalem. And Acts chapter 6 uses this term Hellenist, which is a very broad and term that we really don't know a ton about. It's just used a bunch of different ways in this time period. And so most likely agreed here that it's talking about a section of Jewish Christians who were Greek speaking. So they're Jews, they're Christians based on the story for this group, but they spoke Greek, so they're not from Jerusalem. They're from somewhere else, but they still have a close connection to Jerusalem. So there's a little bit of division between them and those who are closer to Jerusalem, and there's a little bit of friction. And so they start, some murmuring goes on, some complaints is what my Bible has. And it's really easy at this point to go on a tangent about how we complain and how these Christians are just being a bunch of complainers and stuff, because I've heard a couple lessons like that. But focus on what they're complaining about. Like these Hellenistic Jews, or these Greek-speaking Jews, what are they getting upset about? What are they complaining about? They're complaining because their widows are being neglected in the daily distribution. This is probably something we may call like a righteous anger or a righteous complaining. Uh, they're looking out for the people, for the who they're supposed to look out for, right? Look at James. What is in the book of James? What is pure and undefiled religion? Part of that is that you seek orphans and widows, right? Seek to help and support them. And so they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're getting upset for the right reasons. And I do think so. Before it's easy to like go on a tangent about how we have these complainers in the other church. They're complaining for the right reasons. I do think that should cause us to look in the mirror a bit and look at some of the things that get us most aggravated in the church today. Like what do we get most upset about in the church today? If we're honest, I know for me at least, things that have bothered me or upset me with whatever church I'm a part of, they tend to be something that I'm not getting or something's not going my way, and then I get upset about it. And that's when I start murmuring and complaining about, man, I wish so and so would have done this for me, or and maybe that's not you, and that's a great thing. But I know for me, that's tends to where my complaining in church goes to a lot, and I don't like that about myself. And so this story really makes me look in the mirror and say, man, what am I really getting up in arms about when it comes to church conflict? Like, am I really getting upset for the right reasons, for the right people, or am I just getting upset for myself? I know for me, it's the second one a lot of times. But no, these people are saying, look, there are some neglected people in our church here who need help, and they're not getting the help they need. So something needs to be done about that. And so they're getting upset for the right reasons. And so the 12, they get together, they summon all the disciples, and they say, it is not right that we should go up to preaching the word of God to serve tables. Which when I first read this, I was like, man, that's really harsh, apostles. Maybe you could have put it a little nicer. But I think the 12 are kind of saying, man, like we can't really do this. Like I know that's a problem. I know that's what we're supposed to do, but we don't really have the time. If you go back to Mark chapter 6, and the only reason this is like really on my brain is that we talked about it this weekend at Nayati. But if you go back to Mark chapter 6, it talks about the work of Jesus and the apostles. And they were spending so much time caring for the sick and preaching and teaching and all these things that it says in Mark chapter 6, I think verse 30 something, that they didn't even have enough leisure time to eat. Like there was so much going on that they didn't even have time to sit down and eat. So I think this is part of what they're trying to say is like, man, this is what we're focused on. We're doing so much of this that we physically don't have the time or the manpower to take care of this. But also in Mark chapter 6, and what Jesus does in the Gospels a lot, is he turns to those who are saying something, and he says, okay, why don't you do something about that, right? In the feeding of the 5,000, the apostles come to Jesus and they say, man, these people need food. Somebody needs to go get them food. What does Jesus say? How about you do that for them? And that happens multiple times in the Gospels where they come up to Jesus like, man, these people need somebody. And he says, okay, why don't you be the one to help them and reach out to them? And that's exactly what the 12 do here for this church. They turn it back on them and they say, okay, I know you see need, but you step up and do something about what's going on in your own church. And I think, again, that's something that points back at us. What is something here at Red Bank where I can step up and be a help on? What is something I can do to help fill a need here in this church, in this community, or if you're watching from a different church, what is something I can do in my congregation to step up and help um, feed the needs of those around me, because that's an important part of what the church is about, right? And also, a really cool aspect of this is how serious each character in this story takes their responsibility. First off, the 12, they say, man, we are so focused on preaching the word of God that this is just not something we can do. But we take this, our job, extremely seriously. And that's what they make as the core of everything they're about. And I think that's what we need to make the core of everything we're about, right? But is everything we're about all working back and saying, whatever we do, wherever we go, whatever happens, we want to make sure that preaching and teaching the Word of God is central to how we operate. Because if it's not, then something's not adding up, right? But the 12 make it explicitly clear that the core of our operation is preaching and teaching the Word of God. That's what we're about. But they also know that from that comes these needs of serving those who are in need. And so he says, appoint these people. And it doesn't say, again, this is where it kind of gets fuzzy. We don't really know a ton of details. It just says they appoint these people. Whether or not these guys stepped up and volunteered, or if they, who knows, right? But it zooms in on Stephen. And what does it show about Stephen? It shows that there's this need that he was made aware of. Somebody said, man, we have these widows. They need to be taken care of. Stephen, we need you to do that. And what does Stephen do? He gets up and not only takes this job extremely seriously, but takes it to the grave, right? He takes his role as a leader in the church extremely seriously. Again, we don't know if he was just kind of volunteered for that himself, or somebody else said, hey, Stephen, we need you to do this. We want you to do this. But regardless, he steps up and he says, okay, I know this is something that needs to happen, because I know that it's part of the message of the good news, right? Is to help those who are in need. And so he goes full steam in to this job that he's given. And then the rest of the chapter kind of shows where this speech comes from in chapter 7. So chapter 7 is going to have this great speech by Stephen. But how did we get to this point? Well, it's because he starts going around doing great wonders and signs among the people, and a group rises up against him, makes false accusations about what he's doing and what he's saying that he's against the temple and against the law, which are two big things for the Jews. And so he's going to be put in the crosshairs of some of the Jews at that time because of the false witness that some of these people bore against him. But even in the midst of that, in verse 15, and here's where chapter 6 leaves off, and gazing at him, all who stood in the council saw his face was like the face of an angel. For me, it jumps back to the verse, I think it's in Matthew, somewhere in the Gospels, where Jesus assures them, says, don't worry about what to do or say at those times of persecution. The Lord will help you in what you're going to say, but you just remain faithful in those times. And that, not to spoil what happens in chapter 7, you'll find out, but is exactly what happens with Stephen. So hopefully this Devo helped you a little bit as we think about, man, what can I do in my community, especially in my church, to help further the gospel and to help those who need help. If you need anything, if there's anything we can do for you, pray for you, help you out, let us know here at the church, and we'd be glad to help. Go ahead and be reading next week for Acts chapter 7, and we're glad you could join us. Thank you.